On this episode of China Unscripted, President Biden is afraid of an accidental war with China, but that fear is making war with China more likely. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Pottinger.
Joining us today is Matt Pottinger. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, chairman of the China program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and a former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor. He's also the editor and co-author of the new book, The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Matt, it's great to have you on the podcast. Much better than this other Matt we've got.
There are too many Matts I've discovered. It was just a generational, rabbit-like boom of Matts. So we'll create some confusion.
Well, it's in my top 4 of my favorite Gospels.
and the first one, at least in sequence. That's great.
Yes, chronologically, Mark, as far as it being written. But that's not why we're here today. Everyone is talking about China and Taiwan and the risk of an invasion. That's what your book is about. So I think, the solution obviously is to be, really, really nice to Xi Jinping and give him what he wants. So and make him pinky promise that he won't invade Taiwan. So why is this the best strategy?
Yeah. So it's amazing to me how many people have lost touch with the art of deterrence, right? And in fairness, it's not always intuitive, right? There's people are understandably fearful of provoking or causing escalation, and so the instinct has become in pockets of Washington to sort of draw back and say, well, look, we don't want to offend, we don't want to provoke, but in fact, as your question intimated, that's actually how you invite aggression when you're not willing to show that you have both the means, the capability, but also the will to apply capability to hold red lines. And so the book, The Boiling Moat, and I was very lucky to have a bunch of co-authors contribute terrific chapters on what it is that Taiwan needs to do, what are the urgent steps that the United States needs to take, what are the urgent steps that Japan, as well as Australia and Europe, need to take. We focus on the military dimension almost exclusively, not the diplomatic or economic steps that we need to take to enhance deterrence. We focus on the military dimension precisely because that is the cornerstone upon which those other vectors of national power and coordinated power can have a better chance of working. If you don't have a credible military capability, a superior military capability, one that's at least able to hold credibly at risk a Chinese invasion or Chinese blockade, good luck with the diplomacy. Good luck threatening sanctions if you don't really have the military to back it up. And so this is very much designed to be, this book, a list of practical sorts of steps that all those actors I mentioned need to take in order to shore up the military dimension of the deterrence.
So why is it called the Boiling Moat strategy?
You've, I know, heard this phrase that hit some people in some quarters is fashionable to call Taiwan a porcupine, and to urge Taiwan to adopt a porcupine strategy, meaning, if a bear is looking to devour a porcupine, it's not going to go well trying to swallow a beast with long quills that could get stuck in your throat. We thought that wasn't the best sort of metaphor, but in fact, the better metaphor is one that focuses on the key geographic feature that is most valuable to Taiwan's defense, and it is that 100-mile wide body of water known as the Taiwan Strait. If you can turn the strait into a boiling moat, one that is, you create a situation that's so daunting that the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and the other maritime forces of the PRC, shouldn't even want to be tempted to try to cross a moat where they could be brought to the bottom of that strait through asymmetric weapons, everything from anti-ship missiles launched from other small, fast boats in Taiwan to anti-ship missiles launched from shore, loitering drones on the surface and above the surface of the ocean in the skies, long-range anti-ship missiles launched by heavy bombers, torpedoes launched by U.S. attack submarines, that basically this thing becomes a boiling moat. Now, the metaphor boiling moat was borrowed from a Han Dynasty sort of strategist named Kwai Tong, who the quote is at the front of the book, where he says, even strong armies should endeavor to avoid head-on attacks on strong point, well-defended border states that have metal ramparts and boiling moats. Tangchi, it was 经常 Tangchi. So I thought that was a good metaphor for the title of the book.
How did they make boiling moats back then?
That's a great question. I don't know if it was purely metaphorical or whether they were actually able to light stuff on fire using pitch and tar and things like that. I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to light water on fire in those days.
All right. So hear me out. I like your strategy. We double down on global warming. Number one, this would increase U.S. industrial manufacturing capacity. And if we can get the oceans to actually boil,
they won't actually attack,
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Well, but look, I'm not a climate denier. I'm concerned about rising temperatures, but the fact that the United States has chosen to make its main war effort battling climate without the benefit of support from the biggest contributors to a hotter atmosphere, namely the People's Republic of China, seems like we picked the wrong war to try to fight and win when we've got real wars now on our hands. We're watching in real time the collapse of deterrence. And the United States is the long pole in the tent on deterrence. But starting in the summer of 2021, we saw the Taliban disregard its promises to the United States, and we were really driven out of that country. We saw, of course, Vladimir Putin decide just 6 months later, and I don't think it was a coincidence, that he would launch the new all-out sort of phase of his war against Ukraine. The Hamas attacks, which were soon followed by Beijing's actions against the Philippines. By the way, I think that what we saw around Second Thomas Shoal recently constitute an attack, even though Beijing didn't fire weapons. They did board forcibly Philippine government ships wielding axes and knives, and they confiscated a couple of government boats. That's an attack. So we're watching the unraveling of deterrence in real time. This is an extremely dangerous turn of events.
And that's because these powers feel the U.S. has lost this ability to deter. They won't do anything.
Yeah, that the United States doesn't have the stomach to back the red lines that it has drawn, some of them implicit, some of them explicit. If you look at President Biden's video call that he made to Xi Jinping in March of 2022, less than 3 weeks after Vladimir Putin launched his all-out invasion of Ukraine, President Biden got on the phone with Xi Jinping and warned Xi Jinping. He drew a red line. Even if he didn't call it a red line, this is how red lines are actually drawn. What he said was, if you, Xi Jinping, provide material support, that was the word. He didn't say lethal. According to Biden's own account and the White House readout of that call, Biden said, if you provide material support to Russia's war in Ukraine, it's going to cost you personally, and it's also going to cost you access to the U.S. and European economies And as Joe Biden continued, he said, you need our economy a lot more than you need the Russian economy. And so if you look at what Xi Jinping did over the next 12 months, he did test, he did probe, he started to raise his material support, but not in, not in major leaps and bounds. It was more incremental until a year later, March of 2023, when Xi Jinping visited the Kremlin. And at that point, material support for the war machine in Russia skyrocketed from China, absolutely skyrocketed. And Xi Jinping famously, in that meeting at the Kremlin, said, there are changes occurring that you don't see but once in a century. And you and I, Vladimir, are the ones driving those changes together. So this was an admission that not only was Beijing exploiting global chaos, but viewed itself as an architect of chaos. Now, what happened in that year? Why did Xi Jinping suddenly take such a big gamble that he felt comfortable to provide massive material support starting in March of 2023? I suspect that the key indicator to Xi Jinping that President Biden had been bluffing with the red line that he had threatened came in late 2022 when the Iranians began providing thousands of kamikaze drones directly to the Russian military, drones that have killed thousands of soldiers and civilians in Ukraine. And the United States did nothing. I think there were a couple of symbolic sanctions that were announced that had no practical effect on Iran. And once Xi Jinping saw that the United States wasn't even willing to go after the weakest member of the axis of chaos, which is arguably Iran, he knew that he had a green light to help Russia try to win the biggest war in Europe since World War II. And a year later, the United States still hasn't imposed penalties on China, except for some of these symbolic sanctions against companies that are not, they're obscure Chinese companies that don't seem to have much of an international presence, except to the extent that they're providing all the material to make advanced weapons to Russia.
Well, since your book is so focused on practical things the U.S. can do, what should the U.S. have done or could do now that's not these symbolic sanctions?
Sure. I mean, so just to sketch out a few things, and these are things that we think are workable. We think they're affordable. They don't require, a magical leap to futuristic weapons. These are weapon systems that either are in our arsenal but in insufficient qualities, or have been tested and could be introduced quickly, so long as we have sufficient quantities. So the main thing is really our defense industrial base. We've allowed it to, over the course of the first couple decades, the first quarter century of this century, while the United States was preoccupied with counterinsurgency conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia, we got away from having a robust capability for building lots of munitions quickly. And that now needs to be revived, not only by just plussing up existing manufacturing lines, but I think that we need to actually shift away from the old way of defense contracting and towards something that opens up bidding to private companies that don't necessarily even have much of a history. These are companies that are not the big defense prime movers like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, but smaller companies that have very interesting technologies and could probably bid to make more efficiently some of the weapon systems that now are being made at great cost and at low quantity. So the first and foremost thing is we've got to be able to plus up our stockpiles, help Taiwan plus up its stockpiles, license more of our weapons technology to places like Japan and Australia and Taiwan, so they can make weapons, whether it's man pads, which are like the Stinger anti-air missiles, or even Patriot, more sophisticated anti-air missiles, javelins, these anti-armor missiles, ATACMS, things that could turn the Taiwan Strait into a boiling moat. We don't have in sufficient quantity, and we're not positioned to build a whole lot more of that right now. So we really need to have a pretty quick mini revolution in the way that we procure and build our munitions. That's one. Another one that was pointed out, Robert Haddock, who's a very just a brilliant thinker and writer, also a former Marine, wrote about the role of the United States Air Force and the fact that we came to the view that the U.S. Air Force is not sufficiently involved in the planning in a more central kind of way for a Taiwan contingency. Specifically, we're thinking about heavy bombers. Where these are everything from B-52s to B-1B bombers, things that fly a long distance from the continental United States and can carry a truckload, a bomber load of anti-ship missiles. These are the long-range anti-ship missiles, or these things called PJDAMs, which are rocket-powered, laser-guided bombs, which are actually a lot cheaper than long-range anti-ship missiles, but which can hold Chinese surface vessels at risk from a standoff distance, and can get to the theater in less than a day, and then head back, reload, and keep coming. So this is a way to sort of complement what our attack submarines can do. We've got one of our great advantages, of course, is our attack submarines. They're stealthy. They carry torpedoes that could sink a lot of ships. The problem is they're slow to move, right? And once they run out of ammunition, they've got to go a long, long way to reload and then come back into the fight. And the fight, isn't going to wait for them. So we view a much more robust role for the United States Air Force, the long-range bombing fleet. We also believe that the president and his commanders should have multiple options. They shouldn't have just one, exquisite option that has to go perfectly in order to repel an invasion. The more options we have, the more friction that injects into the People's Liberation Army planning process. If they have to plan for a variety of different counter strategies on the part of the United States and its allies. And we can talk during this interview also about the roles of Japan and Taiwan and others too.
So Matt, you mentioned in the book what you were just talking about first, the building the arsenal of democracy, right, with more munitions, things like that through the U.S. It's an election year. It's not always very popular, right, to talk about things like, well, we have to actually increase defense spending. How do you make this argument to Americans when the perception is that, well, the U.S. military budget is already too big, we spend too much on defense?
And Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. So starting with just the overall budget, because that is a point of contention. You've got a lot of people on both the left and even some on the right who say, we don't need to spend much more. It's just not realistic to spend much more on defense. I think that is an unrealistic assessment of the reality and also an unrealistic assessment of the American people. If this takes presidential leadership, it takes leadership from Congress as well to explain to the American people that if we are spending more money now to enhance deterrence, both in the Western Pacific, but also to keep Iran from getting even crazier, to keep these more pipsqueak but revanchist dictators like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, who's now flirting with a war against his neighbor Guyana just because he sees that no one's minding the store anymore. Deterrence is unraveling, so he's starting to flirt with aggression. If we invest more now in order to strengthen deterrence, it's going to be radically cheaper than the cost of having to respond to a war. And that is the lesson of Ukraine. We're spending more to help Ukraine shore up its defensive line in an active war. That's a lot more expensive than if we had just been better at the outset, ahead of that war in providing them with the munitions they needed. The Biden administration suspended lethal aid to Ukraine in its first year in office, reversing the Trump administration policy where we had been providing things like Javelin missiles and other lethal aid for the first time. Biden reversed that and thought that would win goodwill with Vladimir Putin. Instead, Vladimir Putin clearly took those kinds of signals as a sign of weakness, almost as permission to launch his war. So it's a penny wise, pound foolish policy to say we're gonna be really, really economical with our defense spending. And by the way, Shelley, a lot of Americans don't know that our defense spending at about $800 billion last year, that may sound big, but that is a shrinking figure. We are spending less money in real terms every year over the last 3 years at a time when wars are proliferating, but by wars launched by direct adversaries of the United States and of our allies. The U.S. military has fewer active duty people today than it had at the outset of World War II. So our personnel has shrunk to it's almost to a century-old standard. And if you look at what China is spending on its military, the American Enterprise Institute contends that China's real military spending is around $700 billion, not far behind where the U.S. is. And then when you add Russian and North Korean and Iranian defense spending, it's actually almost exactly the same as U.S. spending. Why would we ever want to be in a position where the most aggressive, bleakest totalitarian dictatorships in the world together, this new axis spends as much as the United States does? That is not wise policy, particularly when you consider that our economy is so much larger than even all of those axis economies combined. If you then add together all of the American defense allies, all of our treaty allies, whether it's NATO and Canada or Japan and South Korea and others, if you add our economies together with the United States, we are a $60 trillion economy, whereas Russia is a $2 trillion economy. And we're not willing to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, Russia's on the, spending everything it can. They're throwing everything they can at this, and they're relying on China. China's economy, even if you throw China's economy in with Russia's, they still are maybe about a third of the aggregate GDP of the allied democracies. So, I think Americans would prefer to see deterrence prevail and not see us getting sucked into a catastrophic war. And that's going to require more defense spending. It's also going to require more efficient spending of the resources that we have.
Yeah, I mean, there's a political problem with that, obviously, right? Which is that if deterrence works, you never see it work.
That's right. It's the dog that doesn't bark. Exactly. And so I think right now that political problem is being solved for us, however, by our friends Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and the Ayatollah and Kim Jong-un, right? I mean, they are, Kim Jong-un is not only one of the key suppliers of ballistic missiles and artillery shells to Russia for its war, but now they've committed to sending combat units. So you're going to have North Korean soldiers fighting in Europe in the largest war in Europe since World War II, and we haven't imposed any cost on them for that. We're just letting this snowball gather more and more and more mass as it's rolling down the hill towards us. But we can see that snowball. We can see that beginning of this avalanche, such that I think we can solve the political problem of people not being able to connect those dots.
I mean, we were talking before, Chris, you and I were talking about the kind of libertarian, ish or isolationist idea that a lot of people, a lot of Americans are we don't want to, why should we do this? We need to mind our own business. And I think it's interesting that you talk about this because that may be the communication thing. Like, Americans, do they know what deterrence is? Like, do they understand that it's not just like a coincidence that there haven't been major wars, in the last.
And that they don't see that there is this axis of very powerful authoritarian countries who are unwilling to just, hey, America doesn't want to do anything, fine, let's just let them alone.
Yeah. So look, it takes a certain amount of education. The fact that we haven't, I would consider both Iraq and Afghanistan to be, forgive the phrase, small wars. Not, these were not great power wars. They were very costly wars for us, but they were not anything like the 20th century wars that we fought in the Great War and the Second World War, the Korean War, and even Vietnam. So it's been a long time since Americans have known neighbors who've had to go off and fight a major war, and that does contribute to a sense of complacency and or misunderstanding about the nature of deterrence, or just how powerful of a role deterrence has played in delivering this long period of relative peace that we've enjoyed. But that period has ended. It has ended. And we are now seeing in both the spread of war and the intensification of it. And given that we have not been willing to back red lines, like the one that President Biden drew for Xi Jinping 2 years ago, it invites and encourages those wars to further intensify and spread. And that is the very vicious cycle that we're now in. So I think we just need to educate ourselves. People need to talk about this. We need to see leadership from elected leaders in this country. We need to see people reading more history again. Universities don't even teach much history anymore. It's shocking to me that history used to be a really popular major at universities, and it has atrophied. Things like political science have gathered more student majors as history has declined. I talked to a very bright undergraduate at Stanford University just last week who was a history major, and he told me that in his class at Stanford, I can't remember, I think Stanford's like 7,000 undergraduates, give or take. He says his class, there's only 20 history majors in his class, and that the Stanford history faculty outnumbers the number of history students in his class. This is not a good, like Samuel Clemens said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it frequently rhymes. We would really do ourselves a favor to be reading about even just 20th century history. I just recently reread William Manchester's second volume of his biography of Winston Churchill, which is called it's on my desk here, The Last Lion, Alone, 1932 to 1940. So this is the history of the 1930s and all of the mistakes that the Allied democracies made in not standing up to Adolf Hitler at every opportunity when they could have made life hard for him. Maybe even fatally so. If we had gotten our act together when he moved into the Rhineland, it's quite possible that Hitler would have been destabilized politically at home if he had been confronted. But he wasn't. No one had the stomach to confront the bully until we had a massive war that killed tens of millions of people.
And ultimately, the first nuclear war, although it was only us bombing one of the axes, but that kind of leads to a issue that a lot of Americans are concerned. A lot of people are concerned about, which is this prospect of, if we go to war with China, it could be a nuclear war, and nuclear war is terrifying.
I definitely remember reading a few years ago some opinion article in Business Insider or something that was like essentially making the argument that we should not defend Taiwan because it may trigger a nuclear war with China. Right.
Yeah. Now you do address this in your book. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So I mean, look, one of the negative lessons that Xi Jinping has probably drawn, negative from our perspective, from the conflict in Ukraine is that nuclear blackmail seems to work against skittish Americans. And I think that we should not be so quick to throw ourselves under our desks into the fetal position, suck our thumbs because we're so scared of Vladimir Putin saber rattling with his nukes. I don't believe that Vladimir Putin is suicidal. I think he's reckless. I think he's made a bad gamble. But I don't think he's suicidal. I don't think Xi Jinping is suicidal either. And so we need to keep in perspective that nuclear weapons are really a psychological instrument of war as opposed to a practical instrument of war. And so it'd be good for us to keep that in mind. Yeah, well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
There was something interesting in your book about when you were talking about some of the impacts that, like, if China were to take Taiwan, some of the impacts that would have, geopolitically, economically around the world. There's an interesting part about nuclear proliferation that I hadn't considered before reading this. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Well, look, remember, Taiwan had made a couple of attempts during the autocratic period under the Kuomintang, before Taiwan emerged as a full democracy in the 1990s. Taiwan made two attempts at acquiring nuclear weapons, and the United States put the kibosh on that in both instances. Same is true of during the autocratic period in South Korea as well. If Taiwan is coercively annexed, that will send a very loud signal throughout the world that America's security guarantees may not be enough to rely on, and including our extended deterrent guarantee. Extended deterrence is the term of art that refers to American guarantees that our allies who do not have nuclear arsenals would be protected under the U.S. nuclear arsenal if common adversaries were to attack those countries. And so I think that in the aftermath of Taiwan being forcibly subjugated, you would see a very strong temptation on the part of a lot of countries to acquire their own nuclear deterrent. Japan has all the material it needs to develop a nuclear arsenal, but has no desire to do that, and no political mandate to do that. That might change very quickly in the aftermath of Taiwan being conquered. Same with South Korea, where people actually do talk openly. Unlike in Japan, there's a public debate in South Korea about whether South Korea should acquire nuclear weapons in light of the fact that their foe across the 38th parallel right above them has nuclear weapons in North Korea. I think that they would work quickly to try to develop a nuclear deterrent. Vietnam, perhaps. But this has knock-on effects then into places like the Middle East, where, if Iran achieves this nuclear breakout, which we have, I think, irresponsibly allowed things to go this far. I'm very disappointed I give President Biden credit where it's due on some aspects of his China policy. His Iran policy has been gravely irresponsible. It has given Iran access, basically to a lot more money, a lot more resources, to wage proxy wars around the region that are now playing out, but also more money for his nuclear program. So I think that, Iran may then sprint towards a nuclear capability with knock-on effects on some of the Arab neighbors like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So it's not a great it's not a great development to see the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons to a lot of other countries, some of them rather unstable countries. That is one of the effects that we talk about in the second chapter of the book.
Well, so the book, The Boiling Moat Strategy, what about the idea that if the U.S. does try this deterrence strategy, puts more of its military focus in the Taiwan Strait, what if that actually causes an accidental war?
It's great. Chris, thanks for bringing that up. This is one of those ones that's not intuitive. I'm the first to admit, I worked for many years as a journalist. There are certain things I learned about causes of war after my journalistic years. You know, when I was a Marine officer and then someone who spent a lot of time just reading history. One of the really interesting insights that several historians arrived at, historians who study the causes of wars,
which we know there's fewer people studying history.
There are fewer people studying it, but I'll give you the names of a few who've written some pretty interesting works. One is Geoffrey Blainey, who is an Australian historian. I dedicated chapter 3 of the book to him. I was really fortunate that he took the time to read the chapter before I published it. But also two late historians. One is Michael Howard of both Oxford and Yale, military historian. Evan Luard, the late member of parliament. He was a labor and socialist member of parliament who also was a great scholar who wrote a book about war in international society, where he studied the causes of wars over the course of several centuries. So the conclusion that I'm about to describe to you doesn't come from right-wing thinkers. It comes from historians from a variety of different backgrounds and probably a variety of political leanings as well. What they found is that they could not find a true example of an accidental war over the course of the last several centuries. So there's this myth that caught fire, over the course of the 20th century, particularly with respect to World War I. That there was this popularized idea that World War I was just a total unintended war, and that is utterly false, according to the historical record. Virtually every major player that got involved made a very deliberate decision to get involved in that war. Really starting with Germany. This was not just an avalanche and somehow this conflagration just kind of sucked people in at the outset of the war. There were a lot of countries that did not intend to be in the war who later got pulled into it, but the war began with very deliberate decisions, very deliberate calculations made by leaders. And as the then Chancellor of Germany said, we're going to roll the iron dice. And he did. Now, there were all kinds of accidental consequences of the war, including losing the war, which was not what Germany was betting on. There were all sorts of miscalculations about the course and direction of the war, who would ultimately get involved, how long it would take. I mean, it's incredible to read the record, World War I. Everyone who got involved thought that this thing was going to be over in a matter of weeks. The Germans thought 6 weeks. The UK, the Germans thought they'd be able to keep the UK out. The UK got in and said, look, we'll wrap this up in a couple of months. The Tsar was nervous, but his military advisors said, no, we're going to win this. And it might be a few months. And so, the next thing you know, 21 million people are dead and over the course of a 4-year catastrophe. So it's not
yada, yada, 21 million people dead.
So exactly. So there are accidental consequences, but the decision to go to war is seldom and perhaps never accidental. And so this is important for the process of deterrence, because if we understand that lesson from history, as I believe Xi Jinping does, as I've read Chinese military writing and newspaper commentaries, I've been unable to find, maybe it's out there, but at least from putting several hours into this, I've been unable to find references to the idea of accidental war, like the sign that Beijing is actually nervous that an accidental war might kick off. Although we do see Chinese writing about Biden being very fearful of accidental war. So if President Biden were not so fearful of accidental war, and we know he's very fearful of it because he talks about it all the time, he He's told Xi Jinping personally several times, going all the way back to when the two of them were vice presidents together during the Obama administration. Biden has said to Xi Jinping, my father used to tell me the only thing worse than an accidental than war is an accidental war, or a war that was unintended. But there is no such thing. As counterintuitive as that sounds, I refer you to those historians I mentioned. Read the Causes of War by Jeffrey Blaney, which is a real classic. I think it should be anyone who's going to work in national security should be required to read that book. Because it's pregnant with so much insight about the causes of war and the reasons why peace breaks out and prevails when it does. So if we know that wars are not truly accidental, we will be less shy and less retiring about supporting our red lines and actually maintaining a strong forward presence in places like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait and along the first island chain, because doing so makes war less likely, not more likely. President Biden quite literally has it backwards.
All right. So, for example, like let's say we set a red line that, okay, if the Chinese Navy or Coast Guard or maritime militia ships cross a certain line, whether it's the median line or whatever in the Taiwan Strait, then the U.S. will open fire or something, right? And what you're saying is that China would never actually do it accidentally. It just couldn't happen because what they're really doing is their plan is to go to war, and they're gonna. But whatever happens, like if they want to trigger for that war, then they'll start to gradually cross that line and see what happens. And if they don't want to trigger a war, then they'll stay away from it.
So accidents do happen on the high seas and in the skies when you've got warships and warplanes flying close together. We saw that back in 2001 when a Chinese interceptor jet steered itself accidentally into the propeller of an American spy plane. That was a fatal mistake for that Chinese pilot. It was nearly fatal for the crew of that American plane. So it's not that accidents don't happen. It's not that miscalculations don't happen. It's not that fatal mistakes don't happen. It is that those mistakes do not lead to war unless one of those two actors already really wanted to take advantage of one of these sort of incidents as a pretext to launch a war. In other words, those kinds of incidents are not causes of war, although they are often serve as pretexts for war. But there's a very, very big difference between the two. That we didn't have a war breakout. There wasn't really a serious possibility that we would have had a war as a result of even the NATO bombing China's embassy mistakenly in 1999, or the spy plane incident over the South China Sea that I just described in 2001. Those things were not going to lead to a war. But if Beijing had been planning to try to conquer Taiwan and was getting ready, it might use an incident like that as a pretext so that it could shift the blame for that conflict. But the decision would be a wholly separate one about actually engaging in war. So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw out.
So you mentioned that there are Chinese writings about Biden being afraid of accidental war. Are there ways that the CCP is kind of using that to their advantage?
I think it's a big psychological advantage that the CCP wields over us, because Xi Jinping has even started talking about it to Biden again. According to one of Biden's biographers, their first phone call after Biden's inauguration, Xi Jinping repeated Biden's line to him, where Xi Jinping said, I remember you telling me, a dozen years ago that your father told you the only thing worse than a war is an unintended war. I think Xi Jinping said that with a forked tongue. It was not a statement of empathy or agreement. It was a statement designed to enhance Biden's anxiety about accidental war. And so I actually would argue that it encourages greater risk taking on the part of Beijing, because if they know that we are scared that any incident that might occur, if there's a little bumper boats that goes on in the South China Sea, if Xi Jinping knows the American president is fearful that might actually lead to World War III, Xi Jinping is going to be more inclined to do risky actions in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait, because even an accidental mishap is more likely to cause the United States to back off further than it is to stiffen the resolve of the United States. So it is a psychological advantage that Xi Jinping has over President Biden, and it is one that I would argue encourages greater risk taking and pushing of the envelope on the part of Xi Jinping.
I guess what we notice with this book is just how much urgency there is, and a lot of the prescriptions you have need to happen over the next 2 years. So why is it so urgent?
We lay out sort of a 24-month schedule for really getting moving on a lot of the steps that we lay out in the various chapters across the book. That is because we already know that Xi Jinping is acquiring a capability. He's already acquired massive capability and has every intention to keep building those capabilities in order to make a blockade up to an invasion of Taiwan look like a fait accompli. I'm not sure that Xi is yet confident that he has got all the pieces in place for that, but we don't know for sure what his calculation is. What we do know is that trend line is an ugly one from the perspective of Taiwan and Japan and the United States. We also know that Xi Jinping has made clear his intention to, as he put it, resolve or solve the Taiwan question, 解决台湾问题. This is the phrase he used apparently in his meeting with President Biden in San Francisco late last year. And Xi Jinping even went farther than he had typically gone in that meeting. According to a senior U.S. official who gave a readout of that meeting, Xi Jinping said, look, peace is all well and good, but at some point we need to move towards solving this. So that, to me, that told me that Xi was now prioritizing, annexing Taiwan over the peaceful status quo. That it is a higher priority for him, even if it means risking war. It's a higher priority for him to annex Taiwan than it is to maintain the peaceful status quo. That's my reading of that statement. Xi Jinping, in some of his speeches, has added to his rhetoric over time. I believe it was in 2021. I'll have to go back and check my first chapter of the book. But he made a speech where he said, unifying China, unifying Taiwan is the essence of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is sort of his bumper sticker phrase. This, the Chinese dream for the great rejuvenation. This is his bumper sticker phrase for, I think his legacy, everything that he's trying to achieve, encapsulated in one phrase, both in terms of domestic policy and global policy and the rest, security policy. So I think we should take those phrases and these actions very, very seriously. Take Xi Jinping at his word when he makes phrases like that to his own party infrastructure. That tells me that we should expect that on his watch, he's going to push things to a head. And I don't think Americans or anyone else has a very good record of getting the timing exactly right in their forecasts for when dictators are going to move into a new aggressive phase. We didn't get it right with the Taliban, or at least the Biden administration kind of missed the boat there. Same with Putin. We did get exquisite intelligence that President Biden rightly made public in those final weeks leading up to the invasion that he really did intend to invade. But during the course of the first 2 years of the Biden administration, or rather, over the course of 2021, there was, I think, very little expectation that Putin was going to try something like this. Otherwise, Biden would not have halted the flow of lethal weapons to Ukraine. So we don't have a good record in getting the timing right. That's why I think we would be wise to assume that we are already in the window of danger. And so the 24 months we think is a speedy but achievable timeline for implementing a lot of what we lay out in the book.
Well, so on that point, China recently announced the purge of two former defense ministers, Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe, specifically in the charges against them for corruption that seriously damaged the People's Liberation Army. Do you think that has bought the U.S. time? Was this actual damage? Should it even matter to the U.S. what internally is going on in the CCP? Or should we just do what we do?
Yeah. And by the way, I saw that the Russians just purged, I think it was their deputy war minister. I wonder whether that's tied to, remember, he would have been one of the counterparts of Li Shangfu. I don't know, it's speculative, but I wonder if there is some kind of a nexus there. I wonder. But you're right. I mean, the fact that he's just cashiered and purged two defense ministers plus a bunch of generals in the very critical branch of the PLA, which is the rocket forces, and they have responsibility for the nuclear arsenal, a big part of it. The fact that he's gone through that purge suggests to me that he may not believe that he has in place the team he needs to, quote, solve the Taiwan question yet. But it also suggests to me that I'm a bit disconcerted by the idea that he believes he needs different people in place in his nuclear forces, ahead of pushing things to the boiling point vis-a-vis Taiwan. So it may be that this suggests that he's not quite ready, but it also means that he's trying to get ready. So it's a glass half full, half empty.
I have a question about riskiness, and you mentioned that it might be getting to the point where it's riskier for Xi Jinping to, it's less risky to invade Taiwan than it is to not invade Taiwan. How do we make it less risky for him to not invade? Like, is there a way that, besides obviously the deterrence, the U.S. could, help Xi Jinping, I don't know, save face by not invading? Like, is there some way to rebalance that risk?
I would argue that Xi Jinping does not need Taiwan. He wants it. I don't think he needs it. I don't think that his power is dependent on him, annexing Taiwan. And in fact, I would even argue that over the course of the last 40 years or so, Beijing has benefited more from Taiwan being de facto separate, a separate government from the People's Republic of China's government. That has actually been a net benefit for China, because if Taiwan had been annexed 40 years ago, and it would have meant that it would have had far worse outcomes economically, and because the People's Republic of China has had far worse outcomes economically than Taiwan, and Taiwan's economy surged ahead as a democracy much faster than it did as an autocracy. So I think that they benefit from the fact that Taiwan, for many of those years during the reform and opening period that Deng Xiaoping kicked off, Taiwan was the main provider for many of those years of foreign direct investment, of technology, of managerial expertise and engineering into the mainland economy. So China benefited from having a separate Taiwan, just as it did from having a separate Hong Kong. So I don't believe that he needs Taiwan. I think he wants it, and he thinks there's an opportunity. So what we need to do is inject some pessimism into his calculus. Part of it is to say, look, if you try this and you fail, that's really going to be dangerous. That's going to be a far worse outcome than simply not attempting to take Taiwan in the first place. I think that Geoffrey Blaney, the author of The Causes of War, the great Australian historian, looks at overweening optimism as one of the consistent indicators that war is near. When someone who starts to feel a high degree of confidence and optimism that they can achieve things through war that they wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve, and that they're likely to prevail in that war decisively, and that the war is likely to be fast. When you start to see that kind of thinking take hold, look out. That is your lead indicator that war is nearing. That's also kind of a counterintuitive point in some sense, isn't it? I mean, to say that like optimism leads to war, but it does. But it does. We need to be focused on eroding Xi Jinping's sense of optimism about his odds of doing well in a conflict over Taiwan, and we can do that. We can do that without having to build a 400-ship navy like China's building. We don't have to spend, $1 trillion on this kind of stuff. We need to spend tens of billions of dollars on some of these capabilities that have been tested, but which we have very few, we have in very limited numbers, things that would endanger a maritime force coming over from the mainland.
I was just thinking, just had thought about your warning about if Taiwan is taken, that would cause nuclear proliferation. What if we do just a little preemptive nuclear proliferation and give Taiwan nukes?
I know it's kind of like this is one of those counterfactuals where, what if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons? What if Taiwan
probably shouldn't have given it up?
Yeah, look, if Taiwan had succeeded in creating a nuclear arsenal in the 1970s and was unwilling to give it up, even in the face of American pressure and so forth, it might have led to a different calculus right now. The problem with trying to provide Taiwan with its own nuclear arsenal right now, I mean, there are political problems in a lot of different places and so forth. But one is that Beijing, I think, has made clear that is a red line for Beijing. And my estimate is that Beijing would probably have more resolve to defend that red line than President Biden has had to defend the red line that he drew for Xi Jinping a couple of years ago. That is to say, I think that you could trigger a war by trying to provide Taiwan with its own nuclear arsenal. That said, I do think there are things that the U.S. can be doing in response to China's aggression against Taiwan. Well, it's pressure, that it's military pressure it's putting on Taiwan, and its recent attack on Philippine forces. I think that moving nuclear weapons, some nuclear weapons to the first island chain. Prime Minister Abe, before he was tragically assassinated, had talked about the idea of nuclear sharing, that is, hosting tactical or other nuclear weapons from the U.S. In Japan. I think we can explore some of those things. A lot of that, of course, would be symbolic more than tactically meaningful, given that we can deliver nukes. We don't need to have our nukes pre-staged in Asia in order to deploy them very effectively on targets in North Korea or in the Taiwan Strait. They don't need to be there. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question, Chris.
Right. I mean, we could put nukes in Guam.
Yeah, you can put. Look, I think we need to be building more of these nukes that can be put on the tips of tomahawks. We used to have a lot of these, and they were dismantled during the Obama administration. I think we need to put those back together again, because if we're limited to strategic nukes as the only nuclear sort of option, it actually weakens deterrence because we don't have the flexibility to respond in more limited ways using nuclear weapons in the event that China or North Korea or Russia begin actually using nuclear weapons. I'm not calling for preemptive use of nukes, but what I'm talking about is having some flexibility in our arsenal in order to deter our adversaries from employing nukes.
So in other words, the bigger and more diverse our nuclear arsenal gets, the less likely that any of it will ever have to be used.
Yeah, I mean, our strategic nukes have some flexibility in how they can be employed. You can decide what the cone of destruction can be you can detonate them at different altitudes and different ways to get different effects. But having tomahawks and cruise missiles and things that could be employed to achieve a pretty devastating effect, but without blowing up population centers, I think would be wise on our part. It makes nuclear war less likely, not more so.
Well, I mean, nukes aside, I think, according to a speech you gave last year, one of the most powerful weapons we have is love. I'm just kidding. Love is worthless. You said laughing at authoritarian regimes is
I think
powerful.
love is powerful too. I saw you went to a Lutheran college, so anyway, we'll have another conversation
Wow.
about.
I want to be in the parallel timeline where we explored that now.
We'll talk about the New Testament later, but yeah, I did give that talk at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation keynote, which, by the way, they've got the best name of any think tank or organization, is Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, where they systematically have gathered the evidence and preserved the evidence and present the evidence of communist regimes killing 100 million people in the 20th century, 100 million people. And one of the points I made in my keynote address was that China is on track to meet or beat the 20th century record if you hold China partially accountable for the COVID-19 debacle, given that it handled the outbreak so irresponsibly, covering up all of the key information that it had at its disposal about how dangerous this was, but also the fact that they were doing really dangerous gain of function research on COVID viruses, and inserting, basically adding and enhancing through human engineering, enhancing natural viruses in ways that probably actually led to the death of now 30 million people, according to the median estimate of The Economist newspaper in the UK. So I talked, on that down note, I then talked about the importance of satire and humor, and pointing out the absurdity of communism and of many of these other dictatorships, even non-communist totalitarian dictatorships. I was inspired by some of the writing of Liu Xiaobo, the late Nobel laureate, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who died under arrest in China a handful of years ago. But he talks about the role of satire and humor and making fun of these regimes. He says that when you point out what's wrong with these regimes and laugh at what's wrong, it immediately implies that there's there's an alternative that would be right. When you're looking at what's wrong with these regimes, it implies that something's right. And so satire is, I think the communists suck at it. They're just not funny people. The Ayatollah is not a very funny guy, from what I can tell from a far distance here. Kim Jong-un is funny, but maybe not on purpose. And so I think that it gives us courage to continue to make fun of these leaders. And in those places like North Korea, where people cannot get away with making fun of them, we should make fun of regimes on behalf of people who can't make fun of them for themselves, because totalitarianism is already so complete in those societies. And by the way, remember that the A4, the Baizhi, the white paper demonstrations in late 2022 that helped. They appear to have helped end that draconian zero COVID policy in China. That was an amazing use of satire. It was people holding up, just a blank piece of paper, and by holding up a blank piece of paper, by saying nothing, they say everything about what's wrong with life under the communist dictatorship today in Beijing.
I hope we're not putting you on the spot, but what do you think is the funniest thing about the CCP?
I think just the total absence of just the bloodlessness of so much of its rhetoric, the complete lack of humanity in what it says is ridiculous. And I think that's why so few Chinese really are communists. You've got 95 million or whatever it is now Communist Party members out of a society of nearly 1.3 billion people. I don't think that communism holds much water anymore for the vast majority of people in China. And if they were given a chance to vote, I think we'd see a very different kind of government emerge there.
I've spoken like a man who's tried to read Qiushi.
That's right. I don't recommend it. That's not fun reading, but it is important reading to be reading what Xi Jinping is saying to his own internal party structure. But you're gonna have to. I won't put you on the spot, but I think we should have a funniest communist moments competition to find what's most absurd and laughable about.
That's an episode idea.
Yeah.
There you go.
Top 10 funniest China moments.
It's actually maybe a good competition.
Hey, yeah, we can do something with this. I like this. Well, so I think this brings me to my most important question. You've been sanctioned by the CCP. I've been making this show 12 years. What does it take for me to get sanctioned?
Yeah, I've told some of my friends in the Biden administration that if you don't get sanctioned, we'll know who worked harder while they were in office. Look, I don't know. Beijing has gone after a wider and wider array of people, not just former officials like me. And by the way, they sanctioned me and other Trump administration officials at the moment that President Biden swore his oath at his inauguration. So that's kind of funny. It tells you that Beijing didn't have the guts to do it while we were in office because they were fearful of what the repercussions would have been if they had gone after Trump officials while Trump was still in office. But they've gone after human rights activists. They've gone after think tanks, whole think tanks. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Hudson Institute has been sanctioned. And I think the Reagan, I can't remember if the Reagan Institute or if it was just some of the leadership there were sanctioned. So, they're experimenting with this. It's all designed to try to deter subsequent people from acting on their consciences and doing good work in government or in research or in writing or in journalism. So this is one of those ones that you just have to wear as a badge of honor and keep moving.
That is hilarious. I didn't realize that they had sanctioned you as Biden was being
same
sworn
moment.
That actually says a lot. Yeah, it says a lot.
Says a lot.
Well, this is kind of a related, maybe final question.
Okay.
Yeah. But your proposals in the book are fascinating, but they're policy proposals that have to be implemented by governments, things like that. A lot of our audience, I'm sure that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is watching right now, but most of our audience is just ordinary Americans or Filipinos or people from around the world that are concerned and oppose the CCP, but they often feel powerless about what they can do themselves. Do you think there's something that ordinary people can do to help defend Taiwan, to fight the CCP?
Well, look, the Philippines, the Philippines is just a tiny country and tiny military up against this giant in the People's Republic of China. And yet they are showing tenacity. They are exposing Beijing's bullying by videotaping it. I think people need to stay on their governments and say, look, this stuff matters. This is one of those, we're talking about national sovereignty that's at stake now. And so I think the Philippine people have been pretty admirable and pretty unified in their response to what Beijing's doing. So, I mean, that's one thing to do, is just pay attention, expose this stuff, and hold your leaders' feet to the fire to protect what really matters, including national sovereignty. I think that it probably should inform business decisions as well. I mean, if you've got this country that's bearing down on you, trying to knock you off of little tiny islets that have no economic value or military value for Beijing, but they're trying to knock the Philippines off these little islets off of the coast of the Philippines, purely for the symbolic value of trying to assert a new sovereignty, an imperial sovereignty over the South China Sea and its inhabitants, and also to try to discredit the United States as a reliable ally. That's the other thing that Beijing's trying to do right here, and their audience is also in Taiwan. Beijing's trying to say, look, we can just do whatever we want at will to the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the United States. What's America going to do to help Taiwan, which isn't a treaty ally of the United States? So that's what Beijing's game is right here. And I think we're far past the point where we should have imposed some costs. Now, those costs don't necessarily have to mean a head-to-head confrontation in the seas, but it does mean some military dimension of cost. And that might mean putting permanent missile emplacements all along the first island chain that can threaten China's Navy when it goes off to, or its Coast Guard, to bully the Philippines or bully Taiwan. There need to be costs and repercussions. Otherwise, we shouldn't be surprised if this kind of activity intensifies.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Once again, the book is The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Making sure it's on camera. Very nice. I'll put a link down below for anyone who wants to check it out. But if anyone watching wants to follow you, know more about you, where should they go?
Well, they can visit both the Hoover Institution website. Just type in my name at the Hoover Institution, and you'll see material about the book. You'll also see a lot of my interviews and some of the writing I'm doing. Same is also true at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So I work at both of these fantastic institutes, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD.org. If you type in my name there, you'll see a lot of speeches and things that I'm writing there as well. So thanks again for having me. It was a real pleasure and an honor.
Well, actually, one more question. This is an important one. The Mandela effect. It's the Hudson Institute.
You mean the Hoover?
The Hoover Institute. So when did it become the institution? This is a Mandela effect thing.
It's funny. It's for reasons that I don't know. Hoover has been called an institution, the Hoover Institution, as opposed to an institute. That might not even be grammatically sound, but that's just what it is. It's the Hoover Institution and the Hudson Institute. So I don't know why it's called institution, but that is the proper name.
Well, rather than me believing that I have fused those two names together in my mind, I think it's a conspiracy by CERN changing the fabric of reality. That's the lengths exactly. I go to, Shelley, to not admit a mistake.
That's great. It's great. But no, yours makes as much sense for an explanation as anything else I've heard. But Matt and Shelley and Chris, thanks for doing your show and for letting me be a part of it.
It was a pleasure to have you on. Yeah, Matt's a pretty cool guy. Not you.
Oh.
I'm kidding. You're pretty cool as well.
See, Chris, that's the power of love.
Love. Marriage.
I
think I have a theory why Xi Jinping hasn't sanctioned us. He watches the show. He's a fan.
Oh, that's an interesting theory.
Yeah, because, I don't hate Xi Jinping. I don't hate on him. I mean, it's remarkable what he's done. His father was purged. He was sent to the countryside, and he rose up through all the shark-infested waters of the Communist Party to become its leader. That's impressive.
You're saying Xi Jinping, it's basically a hero's journey.
It's a hero's journey. And so what I'm trying to communicate on the show was that I know you're watching, you probably feel like you've done amazing things, and now like this is this moment in history where you and Putin can team up and change the world. Don't follow the bad, evil path. You can do better. I'm giving a message of hope to Xi Jinping, and that's why we haven't been sanctioned.
Wow, that's beautiful.
That's an interesting theory.
Power of love. Do you believe in love? Just listen to the rhythm of the heart.
Okay. I felt like something was coming, but I wasn't sure what it was.
There's a chance we can make a giant space octopus if you see the music video. Did
this is suddenly going off the rails really fast.
The darkness. Did anyone have anything actually important to say?
No, I think we should just leave it at giant space octopus.
Yeah.
It might have been a space squid.
Hmm.
There is a difference.
Yes.
I think there was a beak, which would imply a squid.
Okay, cool.
I gotta go check. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
Talk to you next time.